Wonderful to see everybody here. Hello, Emma Wilson. Hello, Dana Paulin. Hello, Catherine Benamou. I don't know if I can keep up with all of you, but this is just terrific. Okay, then. People are still coming in, but we're going to get started. We have around 50 people here already. That's our tipping point. And there's about equal that number filing in. So thank you all for being here. I am B. Ruby Rich. I was the editor-in-chief of Film Quarterly. That torch has now passed to Rebecca Prime for the next year, and I'm now an editor-at-large. So this is my first webinar in this new capacity, but I don't think I'll be very changed. So welcome all. I'm very happy to be here with Bruno Guaraná, who is our Page Views editor and conducts all of these on-screen webinars with the authors. And we're really thrilled today to have with us Oliver Fuke, who has edited the new volume, The Films of Laura Mulvey and Peter Wollen, Scripts, Working Documents, Interpretation. Thanks, Bruno. And of course, with him, the subject of this book, Laura Mulvey, who needs no introduction really at this point, but is here with us to talk about the times that this book is tracing, the working processes, and to discuss with Oliver also the making of the book and the labor involved in that. And I will be piping in now and then because I have a wonderful conflict of interest. I'm also a contributor to the volume, having written on one of the films. And I actually have a slight attachment to the other because my loft in Chicago in 1973 was the rain date location for one scene of Penthesilea. It didn't rain, we weren't needed, but I love my past history with this trajectory. So enough self-promotion. Let me turn this over to Bruno. Welcome everyone, and welcome Oliver and Laura.
Thanks, Ruby. Thanks for helping us out with this, and thanks for Laura and Oliver to joining us. I'm very humbled to be in the presence of all of you today, and with such a wonderful turnout. And Ruby just spoiled my little bit of trivia about Penthesilea, but you know, she's the owner of that story, so I'm glad she mentioned it first. I'll say a few words about the book before we get started, and for that I'll make use of two analogies in my speaking of the book. The first one is employing the idea of fragments, which I think informs nearly all of Laura Mulvey and Peter Wollen's films. Fragments also helps us understand the work that Oliver took on in putting together this book, right? And the book really consists of a collection of scripts of all of the films that Laura and Peter made, both together and separately, as well as a number of analytical essays by different scholars, including Ruby here. We could think of each of these scripts and their accompanying essays as fragments that compose the whole of this unique and uniquely important filmography. But fragments also appear in a more significant way to reflect the labor that went on behind the book, because these scripts, and we'll talk a little bit about that, these scripts were anything but scripts, right? So the fact that they appear in such a format really is the fruit of a careful and laborious process. The second analogy that I wanted to make is to refer to these films as monuments, which is a word that I borrow here from the title of one of Laura's later films. Because by putting together these films in such a way, Oliver is effectively elevating these fragmentary texts, and here I refer to both the films and the scraps that initiated them, into the category of monuments, right? So the films of Laura Mulvey and Peter Wollen are monuments of film history that, as I wrote in my introduction on Page Views, remain monumental in aesthetic, political, and intellectual terms. Like monuments, they bear the force and marks of their own time, decaying in some places or even appearing somewhat strange to a first-time viewer. And like monuments, they also say something about our present moment, perhaps even about our own future, which is why I think they remain important texts to visit and revisit many times over. And so it is because of this endurance, and unbelievably really, that I find myself in the midst of living, breathing beings that have paved the way for film studies, film scholarship, film criticism, and feminist cinema. And here, you know, I'm stepping out of the usual sort of format of this webinar to speak not just of Laura, but also of Ruby, right? Both of whom stand tall in the history of cinema, occupying different positions, sure, but also fighting for a feminist cinema, or for a counter cinema for which feminism is but one lens of viewing and understanding the world around us. So that this group of longtime collaborators, Oliver and Laura, and longtime friends, Laura and Ruby, is here today, right now, speaks again of the enduring importance of these films and in their continued importance. Because like monuments, again, these films and their scripts and scraps demand care and attention. That these films have not fallen into disrepair owes as much to their lasting impact for filmmakers, scholars, and programmers as it does to the work of people like Oliver, who has not just compiled a text that remains palimpsestic, fragmented, and open, but also measured no efforts to bring these films to the public and keep them alive. So because I know that none of you here have joined to hear me talk, I'll turn over to our guests, first to thank them, right, for lending their time to Film Quarterly, and second, by returning to this idea of fragments so that we can get to the core of how these monuments came to see the light of day and why it is that we're still talking about them today. So I'll start with how this project came into being, and the labor that went behind collecting these fragmented texts, right, and turning them into scripts in this format. And I know this is a conversation that you, Oliver, and Laura have had lots of times, right, to figure out the format of this book.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much. It's an honor to be here with everyone. Yeah, really pleased. So in terms of how the project came into being, it was really informed by two previous projects. The first was a retrospective I curated at the Whitechapel Gallery, which was called Beyond the Scorched Earth of Counter Cinema, which was a retrospective of Laura Mulvey and Peter Wollen's independent and solo films. And, at the kind of retrospective, it became apparent to me that there was a real kind of critical interest in revisiting these works. There was much to be still said about them. So that was the kind of first event. And the second thing that informed the project was a series of exhibitions I co-curated with my friend and Mulvey Wollen scholar, Nicholas Helm-Grovas, that started at Birkbeck, and it kind of traveled to various places, to Cooper Gallery in Dundee and to Camera Austria in Graz. Each time we reconfigured it in different ways. But the thing we're particularly interested in is how feminist film theory became a kind of important discourse, like pilot discourse for many politicized artists working in the kind of 70s and 80s, but also who look back from today's vantage point to that work and the central role that Laura and Peter's work, both in film and in theory, played in constructing that discourse. So, and it was as we kind of made these exhibitions, the final one of which also included works by Victor Bergin and Mary Kelly and M. Heddich and Kerry Tribe and other figures, we started to look very closely at a lot of the documents that went into constructing these films and developed a real interest in them. So it was kind of out of that I proposed doing the book to Laura. I was particularly inspired by two books, The Films of Yvonne Rainer, which obviously Ruby wrote an absolutely incredible essay in, but also Daniel Villiers and Jean-Marie Straub Writings, which was published by Sequence Press and has a kind of big section of working documents. So that started me thinking about process. And so I proposed the structure kind of very much informed by the Rainer book, that we would have the script for one film alongside a critical essay on it. And I like the idea that you'd have this polyphonic kind of disharmonic book. And Laura agreed. We built up a relationship working together. So we embarked on the process, and 4 of them had previously been published. That was quite kind of easy. And I said, right, Laura, we just need to get the other 4. And then we started to think more carefully and more critically about avant-garde filmmaking, in particular Laura and Peter's avant-garde filmmaking. And we realized, of course, that this was going to be a more complicated process than we had first imagined. And I guess the script for their first film, to which Ruby alluded earlier, kind of illustrates this point kind of most vividly. So that film's called Penthesilea, Queen of the Amazons. It was released in 1974. And when we were looking for that, we found essentially not a script, not a single document that we could turn to, but a kind of series of documents, a series of working documents for the 5 different sections that comprise the film. So they range from index cards, which we used to give Peter Wollen's kind of address to camera, what I call a performance lecture in the second section, pages of typed script for the fourth section, which is where an actor reads the words of the feminist Jessie Ashley, and then kind of notes for camera people and all this sort of thing. And I thought, oh gosh, what are we going to do here? And then we started to really think about what a script meant, what a kind of published script meant. And we kind of decided on an idea that kind of script or film text could be understood as a kind of conceptual unity for all these different instances of writing. And so we began the process of bringing that script together, and that kind of informed and created the rules by which we'd construct some of the others that also needed reconstruction.
Where were these pieces of paper? Was that all Laura's job to find them?
Well, yeah, a lot of them were in personal archives, but we also consulted Peter Wollen's archive is with the BFI, and I consulted quite a few things, and there was a lot of cross-referencing and kind of working out how different things developed at different times. There were diagrams and so on. So it was quite an archaeological process between two archives, but the majority was from Laura's personal archive.
Laura, can you talk about that moment, you know, of entering into filmmaking at that moment, and what led to it, and why, what you were thinking then, what made you want to do it at all?
That is a big and complicated question, Ruby. But I'd just like to say what fun it is to be here for your first webinar, and how lovely to think of the work, as Bruno put it, as fragments and monuments. I'm still trying to take in those two wonderful analogies. But I think the way perhaps I'd like to introduce this, and the way I'd like to put it, is that there was what I think of as an arc, a historical arc, that crossed the period from late 60s to early 80s, which is sometimes referred to as the long 1970s in the UK. Starting with 68 and ending with Margaret Thatcher's definitive victory over the miners' strike, which really established her authority. But the interesting thing to me is that that arc is also echoed by a little film arc, in that the London Filmmakers Co-op, modeled on the New York Filmmakers Co-op, was founded just around that time in the 60s. And in the 80s, we got here in the UK our first fourth channel, Channel 4, which came on air in 82. So that build-up from the late 60s through to a kind of crisis point around Thatcher, and the complexities and interest and excitement of Channel 4 makes a pattern, and our work somehow builds up into it, because it was during that period that Peter and I began to emerge out of being primarily working as theorists and files, etc., and realized we could start making films ourselves. So this is what I think of as how a particular historical moment also offered a horizon of possibility. It became possible not only for us, but for other filmmakers around the scene in the UK to make movies. And this also was because the consciousness around independent experimental film, avant-garde film, across the spectrum, from artists' film co-op right the way through across to Agit Film, collectives, through London Women's Film Group, Berwick Street Collective, etc., all kinds of different approaches to independence experiment, actually got a boost in a way from, I would say, two main things. That it's important to remember that a movement where what might seem to be left behind was the films that got made, in actual fact, there was a huge amount of other kinds of activities. The writing, perhaps in particular, little magazines that kind of disappeared, some kind of continue, seminars, day schools, seasons of films, events, etc., which built up a kind of sense of community and collectivity around that time. So I see it around the mid-decade 74, 75, 76 as a kind of key moment in which we could say that in 74, the Independent Film and Video Makers Association was founded, which gave an umbrella to all these other kinds of films that I just mentioned. Panther Solaire was shown in Edinburgh. Ruby, you came to Edinburgh?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
A key moment. And then Peter and Simon Field organized their 1976 symposium. So I just want to emphasize the amount of activities that were going on in addition to making films. But also the British Film Institute production fund was also open to understanding the films that were being made as having a conscious intervention into avant-garde theory and practice. And Peter Sainsbury said in one of his editorials in After Image, he puts together Hollis Frampton, Zorn's Lemma, and Jean-Luc Godard's Vent d'Est, and says there might seem to be nothing together between these two films, but they're epistemological endeavors. And this recognition that film can be epistemological marks our moment. So Peter and I are really very fortunate in that we probably, in other circumstances, wouldn't have kind of got around, as it were, to trying to transfer our interest in theory, our interest in film as representation and film as meaning, which we were writing about, into the screen itself. So I just wanted to summarize. I want to say how important that context was and how important it was, not just for us, but for, I think, all of us who were around at that time. I can give more details, but let's move on and see if anything else comes.
But I think it was a very vibrant time. And I mean, I think friendship networks played a huge part in it.
Yeah.
But I think also the concentration of so many people, especially in London, with these resources, with the London Council and with the British Film Institute and all of these formations you're describing, created a kind of cauldron of creation and experimentation that perhaps made it easier for you to dip your toe into this and begin to really take seriously the making of films.
And also, maybe just to interrupt for a second, we can't overlook the importance of Edinburgh.
Absolutely.
Bringing all the films together, from whatever strand they were, quite apart from all the other programming work that Linda Miles did. But it was there, I think, that we experienced this collectivity and these friendship networks, which were then built up and kind of went on lasting.
For decades. Yes, I went twice in the 70s, and I think Edinburgh was absolutely unique in putting together mainstream film, alternative cinemas, avant-garde film, with talking about them, writing about them, thinking about them. Festivals never did that, and I don't really think there are any that do now. And I think that was remarkable. And your and Peter's engagement with Linda Miles, who was the head of Edinburgh Film Festival, and with the festival itself, being there every year, helping to stage alternative events, parallel events that I benefited from. I think that was formative. You know, really, I think it's become formative for generations who don't even know that's how it started. And of course, the shutting down of Edinburgh this past year has just been a horrific action. And I'm happy that there's a lot of organizing now to try to resuscitate it and bring it back to life, because that's just been a blow. Thanks for mentioning that, Laura.
I'm wondering, before Edinburgh, what was sort of one of the main impulses in making the first film, right? Because it came about both of you came about filmmaking sort of in a haphazard manner, right? You didn't
Yeah.
seek it out, if I understand it correctly, but it was a suggestion from someone.
Well,
And
I have
From
a
Patty
favorite-
Winnell, yes.
I have a favorite anecdote, and as Sharon is actually there, it will give me great pleasure to tell this story. Um, Peter's professional relationship with Paddy went right back to the mid-60s, when Paddy put together a team of people who could turn their passion for Hollywood into something that wasn't just that was taking popular culture seriously, and was taking the product of a popular cinema as seriously as the product of an art cinema, say. And Paddy was really very influential in that. And when, as inevitably happened with so many people over the generations, he fell out with the BFI and went to Northwestern, he then invited Peter to come over and join him. So in the first instance, Peter's and Paddy's friendship and went on with a common fandom of Hollywood, in which I was a privileged participant. And then, as things changed, as I was trying to describe earlier, we began to see films from other parts of the world, Strasbourg from Europe. The new American cinema drifted across the Atlantic. Films, Bruno from Brazil, Glauber Rocha, etc. So our concept of cinema began to change. And then there was a moment when Peter went to Paddy and said, I'd like to do an MA seminar on the avant-garde. So this was a little bit of a traumatic, wasn't traumatic, but Paddy took it well. Paddy took it well, but it was a shift in Peter's previous cinephile allegiances. And then after a bit, after Peter had been going on about the avant-garde and teaching seminars for some time, Paddy said to us, well, if you two, you and Peter, you and Laura are so keen on the avant-garde, there all this equipment sitting in our cupboards in the vacation time. Why don't you make a film? And so it was Paddy's challenge that actually set it all off. It was Northwestern. So it's really important to see that as a prefiguration of what happened later. And many, many thanks to the wonderful Paddy Winnell. And then Peter put together a team, Sharon, Larry Sider, who's worked on so many of our films after that. He came over to the UK. Anyway, it was a wonderful, wonderful team, and Sharon was our production manager. And that got us off. But I think I could say that that would have been just an amazing one-off experience if we hadn't come back to the UK and discovered this kind of historical context that I was trying to evoke a bit earlier.
Yeah, and so as Oliver sort of mentioned earlier, the production of Penthesilea was rather unorthodox. You didn't follow a script, right? How did that sort of create a parameter to follow along in Riddles of the Sphinx, or even in later films, or a parameter to reject in some ways? You continue on with the collaboration, right, in your filmmaking efforts. But what did you learn from that first experience that you try to replicate, or even to not replicate?
And can I expand that, Bruno, into, like, from Oliver's point of view, what traces there are of this development in the scripts that you two were putting together?
Do you want to go first, Laura?
No, I think you talk.
Okay.
Will you talk for 2 minutes? Because I have to go and get a plug and plug in my laptop.
Very good. Please do.
No problem at all. Okay, well, I mean, I think, well, 1974 is obviously a really important year for feminist filmmaking. It's like Ackerman's Je tu Hillel is released, film about a woman who, and Penthesilea, all in 74. And I think as far as Mulvey and Wollen's practice is concerned specifically, you know, Riddles of the Sphinx was funded modestly by the BFI, and it had a kind of slightly more professionalized production. But nevertheless, you know, it, like the preceding film, retains this modular kind of construction. And so whilst there were some sections that, you know, my excavation of all the working documents show did have a more formalized kind of script than anything in Penthesilea really did. There were also paper traces that were exactly the same. So, for example, in the two films, in the first film, Peter Wollen gives a direct address to camera. In the second film, Laura gives a direct address to camera. But they were both written on index cards, typed out. And one of the things I quite like about the book is the sense in which these working documents are contrasted with the kind of finality of the printed page. So, for example, the script of Riddles of the Sphinx was published in Screen in 1977. But if you kind of consult the documents used to make the film, particularly say the section in which Laura gives her direct address to camera, you can see that it was kind of being reworked right up to the moment of shooting, things being crossed out and edited, you know, and I think that's inherent in the kind of speculative quality of a lot of the kind of theoretical work going on in the film. And so, yeah, so there were continuities in terms of working documents and differences. And I think that reflects the different context in which they were made.
Right.
Should I go on, Laura? Or you good?
Are you joining back?
I'm
You're
back.
back.
Excellent, excellent. Anything you want to add about the approach to production, how it shifted from Penthesilea to Riddles of the Sphinx?
Each film had its own very particular production context. I would say there was probably more difference between them than there was continuum. And this depended very much on the kind of production setup that we had in each case. But also, as time passed, we also adapted to the changing times. And it seems to me in retrospect that Penthesilea had its own very, very special aura at that moment, coming out very much of the Northwestern Department and the collectivity there. And then when we made Riddles of the Sphinx and Amy, we were actually, in a sense, very much at a moment when we knew really what we wanted to do. We were able to make some kind of dialogue between our ideas and our cinema. But everything kept changing. Nothing was stable. And Peter's and my collaboration was always one that adjusted to changing times. And so in a sense, if you think through our films, we were after Riddles, Amy, we made the documentary that Ruby wrote so beautifully about, Frida Kahlo, Tina Modotti, film which came out of an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, and so had a rather different presence. And then when we made our next film, Crystal Gazing, that was in the aftermath of the Thatcher election and the very beginnings of Channel 4. And I think it's important to remember that Channel 4 in the early days gave really a new safe haven to many of the independent filmmakers who were beginning to lose the structures and the background that they'd been used to during the 70s. And so Channel 4 had its own excitement, but its own difficulties came with it as well. And somehow Crystal Gazing was emerged out of that historical moment and historical crisis. So the spirit of utopianism, of aspiration, of looking to the future that had so characterized our work during the 70s became gloomier, it became darker, a shadow kind of fell over things. But paradoxically, at the same time, budgets got larger. As Channel 4 was now putting money into independent films. So the darkness and the production values kind of balance. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
The moment reminded us, in a sense, of the end of the utopian spirit of the 1920s, then kind of overshadowed by 1930 by the rise of the darker forces of the right. And in fact, Crystal Gazing was based on a novel written in Germany in 1930. So it's a paradox that we were responding to the greater darkness of the times, but we were also getting more money for our films. So in a sense, there was no consistency really throughout our work. Oliver, do you think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Then with the Bad Sister, then we were attempting to make a film on wide videotape, trying to respond to the arrival of Channel 4 as the main production point of finance. And we made a much bigger film, but at the same time, we were also in some sense losing our way and not sure where we wanted to go next. So I was quite happy really after that, not to make, I didn't know where to go. Peter, I think we ought to say, especially as it's such an important aspect of the book, Peter did go on to make Friendship's Death. And that was a really important and very lasting achievement. And it's a pity that he didn't ever manage to make more films of that kind.
Yeah, Oliver, anything else about the challenges of constructing the book out of these periods, out of these very different production contexts? Anything you noticed as a result of doing that you want to add here?
Well, one thing I'd add before saying something slightly different is just that the script for The Bad Sister, as it was made for Channel 4, was completely different. It was much more professionalized, less kind of sort of speculative in its construction. And so it was this big, thick, ring-bound script. And here you go, here's the shooting script, and it was completely different. But I should also say something about the book, which kind of actually sort of slightly goes across the periods, which is about Peter's film Friendship's Death. Because one other thing that we did with it, so Friendship's Death has its own section, which publishes Peter Wollen's short story of the same name, which was published in Bananas in 75. And then the script for the film, which was published in a book called Close Encounters. And then it has Kojo's essay on the short story and the film. And so I quite like the idea that these sort of different layers, you see how Peter kind of rewrote and reconfigured the story, introduced new aspects, changed others, and it becomes, rather than a kind of the journalist's monologue as it's in Friendship's Death, to a kind of dialogue between these two characters. And then Kojo kind of has written a really expansive and beautiful essay that kind of tracks these sort of transitions and brings them to bear in the political context, which is so important for that film. So I think that's a kind of, is one of my favorite sections of the book, the way it kind of works.
And also we should just note, since you mentioned it, that Bananas was this wonderful literary magazine of that period. I think it's been forgotten, it's certainly in the US, but worth noting.
Edited by Emma Tennant.
Edited by Emma Tennant, and it published, Angela Carter, J.G. Ballard, a whole group of really important science fiction writers. I have an anthology
ready for
a
revival. Yeah,
absolutely.
Very good. Well, we're just coming up on having 20 minutes left, and that's when we usually open this up to the questions and concerns that those of you who are here online with us want to bring up. So there's one quick, I promised Dana Poland, since he was first on here, we'd take up his question first, but let me just shoehorn in a question from Rena Rosenwasser. How can people view the films? That's like, let's get that out of the way before we go into some of these other questions. Is there distribution in the United States at this moment for the films? Are there any screenings planned in the future? I know there have been in the past. Do either of you know that?
Sorry, kind of dead silence from Oliver.
I know. Okay, something to
know-
work on.
I know that
something-
Riddles is available at BFI Player.
Okay.
Yes, and I imagine
Very good.
Friendship's Death is also available there, and I believe Frida Kahlo and Tia Modotti is actually on YouTube.
Okay. Well, given this question, though, Rena, I think you should speak to Pacific Film Archive at BAM PFA and see what you can get going there.
Yeah,
Clearly a need. Very good. Okay, so here's the question from Dana Poland. Let's see now. It's a question partially inspired by, he had been looking earlier today at a videographic essay that included footage from a Hollywood film, and wonders, Laura, whether you and Peter ever directly quoted Hollywood films within your films, because given the complexity of the passion you mentioned for Hollywood, combined with distance from it, says Dana, what are the complexities of directly including Hollywood clips and their attendant potential visual pleasure? Any comment on that decision to include or exclude such clips?
We didn't include, not that I can think of. We didn't include any clips. We didn't have such a clip culture in those days.
Right,
Mm.
right, exactly.
Now I think infinitely more in terms of clips. I mean, going back to Bruno's original point about the fragment, looking back, we might well actually have wanted to include the odd clip, but I don't think we had the conceptual or technological sophistication. I mean, the one thing I would say, Dana, I'm not, this answers your point, but whenever I was responsible for organizing mise en scène, for instance, particularly rather in Amy, and think about color in Riddles and in Crystal Gazing, I always had the great Douglas Sirk in mind. So even though we weren't quoting, in terms of kind of mise en scène, I certainly loved thinking in terms of the organization of the scene, how colors could speak, how the arrangement of objects, etc., could speak. Peter was also very keen on objects and was always popping them onto the set. But also our interest in shooting with duration, perhaps even going back to the 360-degree pans in Riddles, we always had in the back of our minds, even if it wasn't quotable, favorite shots, say from, well, Offals perhaps in particular, always those tour de force shots in which he seemed to defy the constraints of shooting in Hollywood. And we'd always loved that whenever you kind of came across a long take strategy, even in the most industrial of industrial films, there was always a certain kind of excitement. Something was intruding itself of the cinema, which broke slightly with the mold of the rhythm that was otherwise usually dominant.
And I love that mention of Cirque, Laura, because it circles back to Edinburgh again,
Yeah.
which was the first place that the Cirque films were revived and where he and his wife came. But I also just want to correct the record here. Patty White has added, sorry, Oliver, Patty White has added into the chat that actually Riddles of the Sphinx is available in the United States. It's distributed by Women Make Movies. So that's very important. And if you look in the chat, Patty has put in the link to find it. So screenings are encouraged.
I think Amy is distributed by Women Make Movies as well.
Great. Good to know.
I'm pretty sure the BFI has organized that.
Very good. Oliver, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to add the quotation or the use of some bits of footage in the film. In Penthesilea, in a kind of palimpsestic layered section, there's for the 1930 film, What 80 Million Women Won. And
right.
There's the use of the footage from, I think it's called The Tiger's Coat in Frida Kahlo, which
yes.
Bedotti, and then original footage of, and this isn't a movie, but it's a home movie, but of the footage of Frida Kahlo is kind of
it's wonderful footage.
Oliver, my mind, that's so stupid of me. In Crystal Gazing,
yes, and that's the one,
no, not Crystal Gazing. In The Bad Sister, there are two quotes.
Yes, in the cinema section.
There's one from, what are they? Can you remember?
One of them was one of Peter's students, I remember, and I can find
but she's become very famous.
Yes.
What's her
Who
name?
is that?
Give me one moment. I was looking for something.
Okay, let's talk amongst yourselves.
Since we're talking about where films are available, I was wondering if, Laura, if you had a particular film of yours that you find has gained a new relevance today, or that people should rewatch in this moment in particular.
I think to a certain extent, I think Crystal Gazing. I think Crystal Gazing has found a new resonance as because of the way in which that utopian moment that I tried to evoke earlier has really been dispersed. I think people find something quite resonant there. And also because the way in which the gender, the play with gender protagonists is very different. The two male characters are tragic and doomed. And the two female characters are much more ambitious and self-confident. I also think Crystal Gazing is interesting in that Peter's interest in language and semiotics and so on, which had so pervaded our earlier films, and our mutual interest in language and its place in psychoanalysis. And this is a quick parenthesis to say that one of the reasons why the script book is so it introduces something very different to our work is that it does give a real place to the place of language that was always important from the very, very first moment of making Penthesilea. Language, as we always said at the time, in the first instance means absence of language, and then how language can be approached from a feminist, theoretical, psychoanalytic, etc., point of view in what I think we call the stutter, the hieroglyph, and the riddle.
Very good.
Now I can't remember what I was talking about. I can remember. And then in Crystal Gazing, Peter turns that theoretical interest in language into a kind of ironic interplay between the characters, with one character kind of representing that belief that psychology powers the language, etc.
Let me add something in here. let me add something in here because this popped up in the Q&A, and I think it's a great segue from what you've just been talking about, Laura. This is from Esther Hamburger, who says hello to you, Bruno, from back in Brazil.
Hi.
And she says, it's great to be here listening to this discussion about these films which were kind of forgotten in favor of the filmmakers' texts when they're so related to the text, particularly riddles. And she says that her students love to see riddles. And here's her point, that it's interesting that the question of scripts comes up in relation to these films. She says they just came across the fact that Chitalova worked with very structured scripts. But meanwhile, in Cinema Novo in Brazil, they attempted to get rid of the scripts. So scripts might be an interesting site for a comparison of filmographies in transnational ways, looking at how the attitude towards scripts in use or refusal of scripts shifts across time and place. This is a wonderful observation. I wonder if any of you have anything to say to that.
Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant observation, and you know, I kind of I've been thinking a bit about how, you know, Peter produced all these speculative histories of the avant-garde or the avant-gardes, and you can actually map it onto different relations with the script, and I think that's quite fascinating to think about, from, you know, the kind of proponents of, you know, structural film through Yvonne Rainer to the later filmmakers that kind of developed in the UK in the 80s, like you know, I really love the published script of Isaac Dulan's Young Soul Rebel. So you can find these different kind of relations to scripts across different modes of filmmaking and from different periods. And yeah, I find that fascinating. And I do think when you engage with them, you find so much is buried within the film that kind of just slips away as the kind of images inexorably kind of roll. So
yeah, were there any surprises for you, Laura, in looking back at this body of work and at the scripts? I'm just curious if your own attitudes toward any of the films changed through this collaboration with Oliver on the volume.
In lots of ways it did. I'm going to try and have to think of a few things. For instance, I'd always thought that Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti suffered rather from having that Peter and I just took chunks of the catalogue and made it into the soundtrack and had it read by the wonderful Miriam Margolis. And it's wonderful. But I think this is something that Oliver points out, that originally we wanted to do something a bit more complicated, a bit more experimental with the soundtrack to the film. But looking at it, I realized that it was really quite fascinating, transforming what had been an exhibition of things hanging on a wall in a gallery and with a catalogue alongside it, transforming that into, put this rather differently, that what film allowed in terms of infinitely greater complexity, the possibilities of montage, all those kinds of devices that you can get with the cinema, that completely transcends the literalness of the walls of the gallery. And so, Ruby, this is an opportunity for me to thank you so much once again for your essay, and what fun it was also to reminisce with you about our disagreements. Do you remember? About when we first heard of Frida Kahlo.
I know. That was very good. But I remember that, I mean, people probably don't know that today that you and Peter actually did that landmark exhibition of the work of Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti, and spent all that time in Mexico finding private collections and getting loans and discovering a lot of this work. And I think that exhibition was very instrumental in the revival, at least of Frida Kahlo, if not as successfully of Tina Modotti. Though I just want to put in a plug for the fact that if anyone comes to San Francisco, go to North Beach and you can see the plaque that Lynn Hirschman-Leeson and I fought to get installed in the sidewalk on Taylor Street in front of the house where Tina Modotti lived for 5 years when she first arrived from Udine to join her family in San Francisco. So it's been a great kind of peeling back of the layers in all sorts of ways this moment. So thanks for that.
I have a question for me.
Yeah.
Go on.
There's a question from Lucia Najib on the Q&A. She's fascinated by the character of Laura Logic in Crystal Gazing. How does Laura's music, her kind of, I can't speak German, I'm assuming it's German.
Sprechgesang, yeah.
Relate with the interrogation of language informing your films?
Hi, Lucia. That's giving me something to think about. But I think I'm going to answer it with a slight digression, which is also relevant to the script book, in fact. When in all Peter's and my films, right from the very beginning with Penthesilea, we always liked to have a space for collaboration where there would be some aspect of the film of which we would have no or very little control. So, for instance, in Penthesilea, it's the mime. We farmed out the mime to the mime group at Northwestern University, and it was just up to them. Peter gave them a synopsis of the Kleist, the huge Kleist play, and they had to turn it into a 20-minute mime. That was given to them, and we guaranteed that we wouldn't intervene. In riddles, I think the collaborations become more complicated because the music there that was composed by Mike Rutledge, again, was something that we said to him. We told him more or less how the film would be structured. We told him about the 360-degree pans. We gave him some sense of the spirit of the film, but it was up to him to compose it. And then we have Mary Kelly also as a kind of presence there as well. In Amy, what did we have in Amy? Well, we have Yvonne, but she was reading a text that Peter wrote. Anyway, this went on throughout all our films. But what I wanted to say was that to a certain extent, Peter had a double presence in the films. On the one hand, he was a collaborator. He and I were in collaboration. But on the other hand, he too was a contributor in the sense that a lot of the texts were his writing. So just as Oliver was saying, he wrote the story. He was a writer, and it was really important for both of us that his work as a writer, as a short story writer, as a political writer, should have its presence, and also someone who's interested in language, had studied language, and was interested in experimenting with language as such. Now I remember what I'm saying. Lucia, sorry. What I wanted to say was in the same spirit of these giving space to people to contribute their own idea, their own work, their own creativity. Laura was that in Crystal Gazing. So we didn't tell her what we wanted her to do. We knew who she was. We knew what she'd bring to the film, but it was really up to her to bring her own compositions and to bring her own presence. So once again, there's a kind of freedom there. it's a bit more, perhaps more complicated than in the other cases, because Laura did have to move between being a character in the film and being Laura Logic, the performer. So she has a kind of double role in that sense. And she also has to bring the confidence and the tentativeness of being a woman in the punk world, which she brought so very beautifully to Crystal Gazing. I think she makes an incredible contribution to the film. But I hope that makes sense about how all the films had this space for collaboration with outsiders, and that to a certain extent, paradoxical though it might seem, Peter was also one of those. So another reason why I welcome the script book so much is because Peter's writing actually can kind of come out into the world in a way that it couldn't be literally felt in the same way on the screen.
Well, yeah, Oliver, we're just about out of time. Go ahead.
Okay, I could just add to that quickly that I know that Laura Logic wrote a lot of the film, a lot of the music especially for the film. But one way in which that speaks to the questions actually in the previous film, Amy, with the incredible polystyrene and X-ray specs kind of lyrics, they speak to many of the themes that Laura and Peter trying to approach in the film, but from a different direction, from a kind of post-punk direction. She has two films in it, Identity and Obsessed with You, which kind of speak to many of the themes raised in the book. So there's this sort of approaching of the subjects and themes from different perspectives.
Great, beautiful. And there's some more questions in the chat that we sadly can't get to. From a follow-up from Dana Poland, wondering if you ever gave visual pleasure and narrative cinema as a talk at Northwestern. A comment from Maggie Hennefeld about signaling the book Chess Fever and Possible Worlds about unproduced scripts. Comment from Cass Banning congratulating you for how foundational this work has been. And I want to just end perhaps with Mandy Rose saying, such a treat to hear Laura talking about that exciting period in film culture between 68 and C4 starting in the 80s, and that you and Peter Laura were such inspiring and influential figures for a generation. And so I want to end with that. Thank you all for doing this, for being here. Thank you, Bruno, Oliver, Laura, and thank you all for coming. This will be posted on the Film Quarterly website, where it will live in perpetuity as long as the website does. And you will be getting a link to that as a follow-up to this session, probably in about a week. And it'll be available for you to look at, to use in teaching, to share with friends. So thank you, everyone. This has been a total delight, and go get the book. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you so much, everyone.